Okay, good. It is still morning. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls. You're very welcome to Johnstown Castle. So look, this morning on this stand we're going to talk to you about greenhouse gases and ammonia emissions. So there's been an awful lot in the press over the last couple of months in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously agriculture getting an awful lot of blame and an awful lot of fingers pointed at us. So the objective for today for you is to really show you there's a lot of really practical things you can do on your farm to reduce emissions. Okay, these are practical things that are likely to save you money and that will get credit in the inventory for reducing emissions. So the first one is looking at how much nitrogen fertilizer you apply. And that's an important source of greenhouse gases and ammonia emissions. So how can you reduce those emissions on your farm? Well, the first thing you can do is get your soil fertility right. Improve your soil pH up to the optimal and optimize your phosphorus and potassium levels. And why is that? Well, if you have acidic soils with low P and K levels in them, the grass is inhibited, or the grass growth is inhibited by the lack of those nutrients. And as much nitrogen as you put on will not make that grow a huge amount more. So you can improve your nitrogen use efficiency by increasing pH and increasing P and K levels. When you improve your soil pH, that releases between 50 and 70 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare every single year. So that's 50 to 70 kilograms of nitrogen that you don't have to apply in the bag. So it's a really important thing for you to do. We know on our intensive farms, so intensive farms, which you know are most of our commercially viable farmers, between 40 and 50% of the soils have either too low pH or too low P and K. So we know we're not getting it right on all of our farms. So one thing you can do from today, particularly, is get lime out in your fields and reduce your nitrogen fertilizer next year by about 50 kilograms per hectare. The next thing you can do is make sure whatever grass you grow that you utilize it. There's no point in growing that grass if you're leaving it there unutilized. So good grassland management and extending your grazing where that's possible. And then the other thing you can do is look for feed that has a lower protein level. So you want your crude protein down at about 14%. We know for every 1% reduction in crude protein, it reduces emissions. It also reduces the amount of nitrogen you're importing on your farm and increases nitrogen use efficiency. The next step then is, well, whatever nitrogen you have on your farm, you should maximize the use of that. Manure, slurry is a really important source of nitrogen. So you can reduce emissions from that by keeping your hard standings clean, by covering any overground tanks that you have, by spreading your slurry using low emission slurry spreading methods like trailing shoe and the dribble bar, and also by applying your manure in springtime when emissions are also lower. Some more recent research that we're looking at are basically around slurry acidification. So this is reducing the pH in your slurry from about 7 to 6.5 or 6, and that reduces ammonia emissions by about 80%. So that means there's more nitrogen in your slurry when you apply it to the soil, which means you need to apply less nitrogen fertilizer. These things will not get credit in the inventory unless you reduce your nitrogen fertilizer. The next step then is, rather than buying in expensive fossil fuel derived fertilizer, is can we use biological nitrogen fixation? So getting legumes and clovers or multi-species swards with clovers onto our farms. We know this is a proven technology. It reduces it fixes somewhere around between 100 and 120 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and that's again another 100 kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer you don't need to bring onto your farm. It's another 100 kilograms of fertilizer that doesn't need to be produced from fossil fuels. And then the more recent research that we're doing is looking at development of decision support systems, particularly through NMP Online, looking at sensors and soil-specific advice for, again, improving the timing, the rate, the form, and the location of where we do apply nutrients to our soil to maximize their efficiency. So by doing all these steps, you're reducing your nitrogen fertilizer requirements down dramatically. The final step then is, whatever fertilizer you apply a low emission fertilizer. There is no reason on our grassland farms that you should be applying calcium ammonium nitrate. You should be applying protected urea. Protected urea reduces emissions by 70% compared to calcium ammonium nitrate. It's in the inventory. You'll get credit for it. It's cheaper fertilizer. So it's something that you should be doing on your farm. There have been issues around availability, but you just have to keep asking and asking your co-op for that. There is no reason at the current time for spending money on expensive calcium ammonium nitrate. The more recent research that we're looking at now are the other part of nitrogen, which is the compound fertilizer. So about half of the nitrogen fertilizer we apply, or you apply, is in the compound form, NPK. So there are some forms such as 10-10-20 and 18-6-12 which have a low nitrate and a higher ammonium content to that fertilizer. And that's similar to protected urea. The reason for not applying calcium ammonium nitrate is you're applying nitrate to the soil. And when we apply nitrate to a wet soil, it results in nitrous oxide emissions. Where we don't apply nitrate to the soil, the grass still grows, but we don't end up with such large amounts of nitrous oxide. So I'm going to hand over to Gary now to talk about methane and carbon.
Okay, thanks, Karl. So what Karl has been talking about is nitrous oxide, which is about 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions, but the other 75% is made up of methane. Okay, that methane is broken down into two parts. First of all, 80% of methane comes from enteric fermentation or by ruminants belching out methane. And then the other 20% comes from manure management. Okay, so how do we get at trying to reduce methane? Well, we've two main approaches. First of all, to reduce the carbon footprint associated with milk and meat produce. So if you look at dairy EBI, for example, the carbon footprint of a litre of milk is just under 1 kilo of CO2 equivalents, and that's substantially down about 25% over the last 10 years. Again, by improving beef genomics, improving fertility on the maternal side, or improving live weight gain in terms of terminal traits, again, we can reduce the emissions per kilo of beef produced. But if we want to reduce the total amount of methane that's produced, really what we have to do is look at more interventionist methods. So even though manure management only makes up about 20% of methane, it's the more easy source of methane to reduce. And what we've seen there is by the use of acidification, additives, and also slurry aeration, we can reduce methane emissions from manure management from somewhere between 60 to 85% or so. So that's an absolute reduction in methane. We're also looking at reducing the finishing times of animals. So again, reducing the finishing time of beef finishers by somewhere between 1 and 3 months. And then also, you'll see later on in the tour, we're looking at feed additives. So these are the things like 3-NOP, like the seaweed extracts, and what they're showing is a reduction if they're fed in a total mixed ration diet of somewhere around about 30%. So, as well as agriculture emitting methane and N2O, agriculture is also one of the few sectors that can actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere, okay? And that's important because CO2, once it's emitted, sticks around in the atmosphere for around about 10,000 years. So, the first thing we're doing, if you look over at our eddy covariance tower, we have these CO2 monitoring towers. We have about 30 of them around the country. So this is the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, and what we're measuring is the amount of CO2 that's sucked up via photosynthesis and that's released from respiration, and we're monitoring that 10 times a second, every second of the day, every day of the year. Okay, so we have two towers here, one on multi-species sward, so we're looking at what's the impact of a multi-species sward versus a perennial ryegrass sward. We're also on some of the sites going to be looking at things like the altered stocking rate, altered nutrient management. On croplands, we're looking at strong corporation, at cover crops. We've also been looking at hedgerow management, and again we've a stand on hedgerow management, and what we've seen there is that by allowing your hedgerows to grow out a metre and up a metre, you can treble the amount of carbon that's stored in your hedgerows. Forest and forestry management, again, moving to continuous cover forestry, and again upping the rate of afforestation and the species mix in our forests. And then the last thing is peat soil management. So again, we know our peat soils generally that are under agricultural production emit CO2, but we don't know how much. So the first thing we're doing is measuring how much it's emitting, and then after that seeing, well, what management practices can we use to reduce the amount of emissions from those peat soils. And then the very last thing that we're looking at as well is decarbonisation. So how can farms contribute to the wider decarbonisation of our energy system? And that can be via solar panels, so solar PV, the use of plate coolers, and then also the use of grass and slurry in biogas or biomethane facilities. So really the take-home message then is to maximise here the opportunity to store extra carbon on your fields, and then also reduce your energy consumption and, if possible, contribute to decarbonisation. Thank you.